begin by carrying on a conversation already circulating at our conference. Actually, it's a reference to a perennial question for education historians. That is, how do you justify the study of our field to students, colleagues, and the general public? Why does our work matter? As I prepared to introduce the 57th president of the History of Education Society, it occurred to me that one could craft a solid answer to that question by studying the CV of our friend and colleague, Jackie Blount. Here's my three-part response. First, looking back at life experiences, whether of a single person or in the aggregate, helps us appreciate the weight of both the promise and the problems associated with school. I believe there's a sociological theory there to be tested. At its best, schooling, or some aspects of it, can unlock human potential, provide outlets for discovery, and set a person on a lifelong course of development and fulfillment. It can make musicians and scientists of us, teachers and historians, or if we're lucky, a little bit of all that. Some years ago, an 8th grade teacher in an Appalachian school put a French horn in Jackie's hands. That led to the prestigious John Motley Moorhead Foundation Scholarship and a degree in music at the University of North Carolina. The foundation characterizes the recipients of this scholarship as those who embrace not only a lifetime love of learning, but also a desire to make an important and positive impact through their chosen fields. HES should be grateful that the foundation opened the scholarship to women in 1974, just in time to recognize the talents of a kid from Asheville. I'd like to point out that it wasn't just any instrument that Jackie picked up as a music major, it was the French horn, just as it wasn't any old bass that she later learned to play after earning tenure at Iowa State. It was a 6-string bass, and I understand there's a considerable difference. Some of you know that Jackie has recorded with the remarkable singer-songwriter B.J. Fleming. If you haven't heard this music, let me just tell you that B.J. is one of the most thought-provoking writers I know. The critics call her work rich and dynamic. I've read that bass players find their technique through adaptation, the point being that instruments are designed to produce a particular sound rather than to fit the human body, so that musicians have to experiment to find their groove. So it is with life in general. Given the bias against women band directors still quite apparent in the 1980s, Jackie decided to obtain a teaching license in a field more suitable for women, physics. This she did with the support of a Dean Smith scholarship at UNC. Soon she was creating challenging and fun labs for students at a North Carolina high school, and even coached the girls' track team to a second-place finish at state. I'd like to suggest that accomplishment reflects Jackie's leadership ability rather than a deep commitment to the world of sport. Although her curiosity, or perhaps it's really friendship, does allow room for talking about baseball. And every so often in Columbus, Ohio, football. Having been involved with a local affiliate of the National Education Association during the years she worked as a physics teacher, Jackie was elected to lead the organization in her 5th year in the district. She organized successful efforts to defend teachers who had been demoted, transferred, fired, or unduly reprimanded. Some of these cases involved race discrimination. In others, the teachers were thought to be gay or lesbian or otherwise displayed gender nonconformity. The turmoil in the district, of course, reflected discrimination against teachers that was playing out across the nation. In this case, it launched an impressive career in the academy. A second response to why history of education matters is that it provides a foundation for designing effective civic policy. While our research is rooted in the archives, informed through interviews, and emerges through the long, hard work of tracing change over time and through multiple contexts, it is important that the audience for that work extend beyond our disciplinary boundaries. As Carl Becker noted in his presidential address to the American Historical Association in 1931, research will be of little import, except insofar as it is transmuted into common knowledge. The history that lies inert in unread books does no work in the world. One of the most notable characteristics in Jackie's career has been the way in which she brings solid historical research to bear on contemporary issues in education. She began that work with the 1998 publication of her award-winning book, Destined to Rule the Schools, Women in the Superintendency. That analysis provided the historical grounding for a special feature in Education Week at the turn of the 21st century, when scholars were still lamenting the problem captured in the news headline, Women Superintendents Few and Far Between. Jackie has traversed the gap in scholarship between history of education and educational leadership and administration, between history and philosophy, and of course between history of education and gender and sexuality studies. She was the first historian to publish on LGBTQ education in the Harvard Educational Review, Review of Educational Research, and History of Education Quarterly. Last year, Jackie organized a Philosophy and History of Education Symposium to mark the launch of a revitalized program at Ohio State under the collaborative direction of the Columbus crew of Blount, Irante, Kimball, and Warnick. As an associate dean of various stripes and multiple assignments, first at Iowa State and more recently at Ohio State, Jackie has traveled from Australia to Saudi Arabia in dialogue with colleagues regarding higher education. She leveraged her political skill to guide a faculty senate toward implementation of fully equal domestic partner benefits, well ahead of that particular curve. Her students have named Professor Blount a faculty member who made a difference many times over. I'd say Jackie knows how to put her research to work in the world. My final point is closely related. As Jackie put it in Fit to Teach, the knowledge of how current conditions developed in specific historical context opens our most deeply embedded assumptions to question and critical analysis. I think there is probably an inverse relation between just how deeply any particular social thought or practice is entrenched and how freeing new historical insight can be. Fit to Teach, Same-Sex Desire, Gender, and Schoolwork in the 20th Century gave those of us who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer a legacy to stand on, a heritage of sorts. It gave all of us a better understanding of how schools have regulated the gender and sexuality of the nation. And let's not forget, that book was written before LGBTQ archives were fully resourced, when you had to ring a doorbell and make your case simply to get inside, when the pages of precious documents hidden away in stacks had been ripped away or defaced beyond use. I know I speak for a generation of scholars who are exceedingly grateful for that work. And now there's Ella. Actually, Ella Flagg Young has been present in Jackie's research all along. She peers at readers from the cover of Destined to Rule the Schools, provided the title even. She and her partner Laura Brayton appear on the first page of Fit to Teach. And I've seen enough of the forthcoming biography to know that Jackie's analysis of the life of Ella Flagg Young is going to shake history of education to its foundations. I believe you all understand why that matters. Please welcome our president, colleague, and I'm proud to say my friend, Jackie Blount.
So I think you should be the official introducer for everybody from today. That's extraordinary. So now I have to try to deserve that. Karen has been such a part of my work, my research in recent years, and we've had so many glasses of bourbon and engaged in all sorts of other activities that it's absolutely important to say that she's very much a part of this project today. And I am incredibly grateful. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Kim Tolley, who's done an amazing job of organizing the conference. I've said it so many times. I only wish I could have gone on any of the tours, but I've been kept busy, so I'll make up for it somehow. I also want to thank my wonderful colleagues at Ohio State University and the students there too, because I came there as an administrator, but they welcomed me onto the faculty with open arms. I especially want to thank Antoinette Arante, who's here tonight, and Bruce Kimball, who's here tonight, and the Ohio State students who are sitting here in the front and elsewhere in the audience. You all inspire me and you challenge me, and I love working with you. So thank you for that. I have to say that I would not have engaged in this work if I hadn't stumbled across a biography by Joan K. Smith that was published in 1979 that was about Ella Flagg Young. I was doing my doctoral work, I found this book, I pulled it off the shelf, I blew the dust off of it, I opened it up, and I was flabbergasted to know that there was a woman who had lived this life. And I was even more flabbergasted that I didn't know who she was. So I sort of worked around the edges, as Karen said, on her story, but now I'm focusing on it full time. The full-length biography that I'm working on is going to carry on in Joan Smith's spirit, and I bring to it new sources that weren't available to her at that time. Finally, where's Kate Romanier? There you are. Okay. I also want to thank you for all of your really important work on teachers' unions, and especially Margaret Haley. I think you're going to see that my work is going to dance with yours in this piece. And finally, I thank B.J. Fleming for everything. Ella Flagg Young became one of the most famous women in the country on July 30th, 1909. That's when newspapers coast to coast carried front-page news that she would be Chicago's next superintendent. The Board of Education specifically had sought a man for this job and launched an extensive search to find him. Instead, however, members chose a woman to lead the schools of the nation's second largest city. The news was surprising, perhaps even shocking to some. At the same time, though, some significant forces had aligned in Young's favor. Teaching had long since shifted from men's to women's work. Women also had begun winning elected county superintendencies. Suffrage activists, many of them current or former teachers, had campaigned in part so women educators could vote on matters affecting their working conditions, but also because they wanted their service as school leaders to show that women were capable of great public service. And crucially, some of Chicago's teachers, awakened to their need for collective power, had organized the Chicago Teachers Federation to counter antagonistic city and corporate officials. The Federation had sought a superintendent who wanted to improve teachers' conditions, and Young stood out as their best bet. Beyond these external conditions, Young also brought extraordinary personal gifts with her work, and she did so just as opportunities for women opened in education. For example, she had studied at Chicago High School nearly a half-century earlier, precisely at the inflection point when young women began graduating in greater numbers than young men. Then, throughout her long and distinguished career, she became one of the first, if not the first, women to rise into a succession of new realms of educational leadership. After teaching for only 3 years, she became a teacher of teachers, then one of the first women principals of a large school, one of the first women assistant superintendents, among the earliest women professors at a major university, and eventually she was the first woman elected president of the National Education Association. She cleared paths for other women to join her along the way. Young thought that women's school leadership would continue expanding, something she confidently predicted after she became superintendent. From her perspective, conditions also appeared ripe for teachers to free themselves from the constraints of stale, older methods, as well as those pushed by a new class of administrators bent on centralization and standardization. Instead, she envisioned teachers enjoying greater freedoms in schools while cultivating their unique gifts and nurturing those of their students. She expected teaching to become ever more intellectually and creatively engaging work. And she believed the women who overwhelmingly dominated the ranks of teachers would work together with their allies in a spirit of community, buoyed by their suffrage-driven women's movement. Throughout her career, Young built community among educators. At the same time, she fiercely promoted what she said was individuality, freedom for the teacher, and freedom for the pupil. Her hobbies. During a time when some prominent male education leaders increasingly centralized power in schools, mechanized their operations, divided units into discrete, often disconnected parts, and disempowered the largely female teaching force, Young staunchly opposed their efforts. She instead shared power with teachers, facilitated their working together towards ends they determined collectively, and respected their individuality, all while insisting on high-quality work. As superintendent, she and Chicago's educators and students soon demonstrated that a large school system could defy prevailing administrative trends by empowering rather than disempowering its members, by working together rather than treating into isolation, and by improving the quality of the system through volition rather than compulsion. Morale soared during much of her superintendency as she supported teachers' and students' efforts, and as they in turn supported hers. Ella Flagg Young's story then sheds light on an important historical moment when officials increasingly configured school administration for men, enlarging their administrative powers while simultaneously stripping away freedom, individuality, and a sense of community from the recently feminized teaching force. In this way, the gender polarization of schoolwork aligned closely with the movement to disempower teachers. Young's story also reveals the important ways she resisted this trend. She essentially sought to build community among educators while simultaneously enlarging their freedoms and respecting their individuality. They, in turn, organized, they grew more powerful, and they rallied to support her and each other through an array of vexing challenges. This mutual support was vital to her superintendency, as well as to the welfare of teachers and students alike. Though Young had thought that women would exercise ever greater leadership in education, from the classroom to the superintendent's office, the question remained open as to whether her superintendency would prove to be a fluke or a harbinger of deep change. Young's pursuit of individuality and freedom began early. She was, after all, a gifted but eccentric child in a family that valued uniqueness. Her parents urged their children to learn on their own rather than by attending school. Her mother read avidly. Her father, who was orphaned as a child, quickly earned his freedom from a metalworking apprenticeship and then became a renowned fine instrument maker. Young's older brother became an aspiring artist, and he enlisted at the start of the Civil War. Then, as a talented baseball, pitcher, he founded one of the earliest baseball teams and leagues in the country. Young's brilliant older sister, whose name she never spoke publicly, supported herself as a seamstress. Then in early adulthood, she was committed to the House of the Good Shepherd, where she lived as an inmate until her death at 61. Flagg family members followed their own paths. Ella Flagg did not learn to read until she wanted to, at 8 or 9. Her mother had read aloud a newspaper account of a fatal school fire, and Ella, inconsolable over the tragedy, studied that article with her mother's help. Reportedly, she read voraciously from then on. At 13, she attended grammar school for a couple of months, but she found the classwork so boring that she dropped out. At 15, her friends persuaded her to take the teacher's examination, and though she passed, she was too young to get a teaching certificate. Instead, the superintendent invited her to enroll in Chicago High School's new normal department. First, however, she needed to pass the admissions examination. Principal George Howland asked her to recite a poem, which she did in an idiosyncratic manner with syllables accented in very odd places. Perplexed, he asked her why she had done this. She explained that she intended to keep the poem from being too smooth. Howland laughed and admitted her. In later years, he became superintendent and hired her as assistant superintendent, eventually even recommending her as his possible replacement when he retired. From the start, the unconventional Ella Flagg thought about schools from an outsider's perspective, but she eventually flourished with support from accepting mentors like Howland. Ella Flagg began teaching in 1862 just as Illinois men enlisted for service in the Civil War. Women already held all of Chicago's grade school teaching positions other than principal. She quickly excelled in some of the city's toughest classrooms. After her third year, she became principal of the new School of Practice, charged with preparing the city's future grade school teachers. The superintendent soon lauded the School of Practice. With her leadership, he explained, quote, "It is not excelled by any similar school in the country," unquote. Notwithstanding his exuberant praise, Young ran into trouble when board members pushed her to admit weak students. Instead, she refused and resigned, returning to teaching a regular class. Then in 1873, Illinois passed a law allowing women to hold elected school offices. 10 women quickly won contested county superintendencies. During this early wave of Illinois women moving into school administrative positions, the Chicago board appointed Young to a full principalship, making her one of the first 5 or 6 women principal of large schools in the country, as she later recounted. The board promoted her again 3 years later, this time to the principalship of one of the largest and the most visible schools in the city. She worked closely with teachers in this school, urging them to cultivate unique pedagogical approaches. They made decisions together, and rather than holding meetings at school, she regularly hosted teachers in her home where she served lavish refreshments and encouraged lively discussion of books that teachers chose. Her school became known as one of the finest, if not the finest in the city, and visitors regularly requested tours. Many of the city's inspired teachers soon rose to leadership positions across the city, too. Superintendent Howland was confident enough about Young's capabilities that he asked her to lead meetings of the Chicago Principals Association in his absence rather than any of the more long-serving male principals. Howland also invited A.E. Winship, a prominent education journalist, to visit Young's school during the Chicago portion of his national tour of schools. Winship observed one class that Young taught while principal, and he left saying, "That is the most remarkable teacher I ever saw." Winship then lavished her with praise in speeches that he delivered around the country and articles he published, bringing Young to national attention. Soon after Winship lauded her, the board promoted Young and another woman to assistant superintendencies, the first women to reach this level in Chicago's history, and certainly among the first in the country. Young's selection surprised no one. Chicago Women's Club members had contributed to this breakthrough all the persistent pressure. Young's stature grew during her years as assistant and then district superintendent. Though cozy teachers' meetings in her residence were no longer feasible, she instead created a teachers' council to stay in close communication with educators throughout her sprawling district on the south side of town, which extended well over 100 city blocks from north to south. This was perhaps one of the first, if not the first, teachers' councils organized for decision-making rather than simply as a professional association. Other assistant superintendents in the city followed her example. Young also organized a series of popular teachers' institutes. One attendee said, quote, "Her lectures are largely attended, but not from duty, but from pleasure. She's a fascinating speaker," unquote. As a further expression of admiration, some Chicago women principals formed an organization they called the Ella Flagg Young Club in her honor, despite her protest. When the city created a teacher pension fund, Young became a trustee by winning by far the greatest number of votes among all school employees. One writer explained that the lopsided vote reflected teachers' quote, "high personal respect for her, and that she had every reason to be proud of this expression of the esteem and affection in which she is held by the teachers of Chicago," unquote. Young also capitalized on her growing reputation by helping to instigate a statewide meeting of women teachers and administrators. Men already had their state education association, she reasoned, but women had none. So during this founding event, attendees formed not one, but 2 new associations of women educators, the Schoolmistresses Club, which elected Young as its first president, and then the Illinois Women's Teachers Association. Before the gavel brought the meeting to a close, these new conjoined groups decided to lobby the governor to appoint a woman to the State Board of Education. The governor responded immediately by naming Young, who then became the first woman on the Illinois Board of Education, serving for 25 years with distinction. The Chicago Women's Club invited Young to join after she became superintendent too. She accepted and then helped members understand the intricacies of the city's significant school-related matters. The club immediately intensified its effort to lobby for women to be appointed to the Board of Education, an effort that had run aground in the past. With Young's guidance, however, their efforts finally paid off. Chicago soon had its first woman Board of Education member, and in the years to come, more would be named, including Jane Addams. Young enjoyed the years with Superintendent Howland at the helm. He engaged the city's administrators in spirited discussions about a wide range of issues. He vigorously supported those who implemented innovative programs. He granted them independence if their schools performed well, creating an environment in which Young thrived. She also respected Superintendent Albert Lane, who succeeded Howland. Matters quickly changed, however, when Benjamin Andrews became the superintendent in 1898. William Rainey Harper, the University of Chicago's ambitious president, served briefly on Chicago's Board of Education. He thought the city needed a new superintendent, one with superb academic credentials rather than a career educator who had risen through the ranks as had been the tradition. Harper wanted Benjamin Andrews for the job. Andrews formerly had served as president of Brown University and was Harper's old friend and mentor. Harper and other board members then pushed out the amiable Superintendent Lane and instead hired Andrews. Once Andrews settled into his new work, he said, "I never in my life was engaged in so absorbing a work as this. This work is hard, much harder than the work of a college president, but also much more important." Harper then cycled off the board. He went on to lead the Chicago Education Commission, or the Harper Commission, in formulating its famous report arguing for reducing Board of Education powers while increasing those of the superintendent, a change that teachers derisively called one-man power. The commission also proposed that men be paid more than women, so more men could be hired, which women teachers found particularly odious. Finally, the commission recommended that the city stop hiring married teachers. Ella Flagg Young wasted no time in criticizing some of the Harper Commission's recommendations. In January 1899, she delivered an address to a packed gathering of 2,000 people from several new educators' organizations in the city. She decried the recommendation that men be paid more than women in comparable positions. She adamantly disapproved of barring married women from teaching. She particularly criticized the Harper Commission for dodging the woman question, even though she contended that it attended in detail to other matters of much less concern. She said, "Why the commission could not recognize its inability to cope with a woman question puzzles some of us. The commission was hostile to women." Young then criticized the new class of administrators who contributed to the commission's report, asserting that they wanted to exert minute control over teachers. She argued that the commission had failed to include teachers meaningfully in its process, hiding its true aims while wasting teachers' time with pointless committee work. In the end, she said, teachers have been forced to resemble too closely the housewife who goes about from room to room making sure that no speck of dust rests therein, the housewife who deceives herself into thinking that she would enjoy a brush with the world outside, or things in art, literature, and science if she only had time after attending to the important, the essential things of the world, the specks of dust. Young completed the link between the conditions of teachers, mostly women, and the increasing strictures on their work. and she envisioned what must happen instead to inspire me to change. One condition is important, essential, she said, an evolution of individuality in principals, teachers, and superintendents. That is, an evolution of the gifts peculiar to each soul. Each person possesses individual gifts, she argued, but these often remain undeveloped. For individual talents to be realized, we must have opportunity for what is called free play of thought. If our daily work contains so much of the directions and plans of others that the feeling of drudgery permeates it and us, then that necessary free play of thought is lacking. The serious defect in the organization of our schools, however, is that teachers are required to carry such heavy curricular loads that the sense of uneasiness from superficial preparation and the sense of weariness from continuous skimming result in a feeling of drudgery. Young closed by congratulating teachers in the city for creating their new organizations in the face of these challenges, especially the Chicago Teachers Federation. She encouraged them all to grow stronger, and the room thundered with applause. Hundreds of teachers crowded around her after she finished, thanking her for having articulated their thoughts so accurately. A few days later, Young resigned from the Chicago schools, ending her 37 years of service. Her longtime companion, Laura Brayton, explained, quote, "The time came when the autocratic regime, which reduced assistants to mere machines, and the everlasting playing of politics in the office of the superintendent of schools became unbearable, and she resigned," unquote. Young herself said, "The present ideal seems to be a one-man power, and my work is rendered unnecessary." The news shocked and devastated teachers around the city. One lamented, quote, "The women teachers of the Chicago schools needed Ms. Young's help and guidance now more than ever to help them against the policy of the school management, which seemed disposed to remove women from positions of responsibility," unquote. The editorial board of the Chicago Tribune described Young's departure as a grievous loss for the city. Another editor deemed it a calamity because, quote, "It is next to impossible to place a man or a woman in her position who can hope to win the unanimous support and goodwill of teachers, patrons, pupils, and supervisors to the extent which Ms. Young has possessed them." Young then completed her doctoral studies with John Dewey at the University of Chicago and joined the faculty as associate and then full professor. From this vantage, Young stayed near the city's teachers, and they regularly packed auditoriums to hear her speak. However, while teachers largely admired her, her early positive relationship with the Chicago Teachers Federation grew more complex. She originally had supported the teachers who founded the Federation. On the other hand, she later explained, quote, "I saw the beginnings of the Chicago Teachers Federation and I felt very uneasy. I feared those teachers were becoming too grasping. I was not large enough in the beginning to see that these women were realizing that they had not the freedom, the power which people should have who are to train the minds of the children," unquote. Despite any misgivings she may have developed, Young found ways to assist members of the Federation as they pushed for a greater leading presence of women teachers, for example, in the NEA. As the Federation's Margaret Haley demanded the right to speak from the floor of the NEA General Assembly, and Catherine Goggin devised strategies to broaden women teachers' power in the association, Young worked in concert with them, but from a different vantage point. Remarkably, Young served on the NEA's National Council, the group David Tyack has called the Educational Trust for the Old Guard. In this role, though, Young refused to be muzzled by council members. Instead, during a General Assembly, she spoke out against the consolidation of power by other members of the council. She charged that, quote, "high-salaried NEA officials happily pointed the way to educational perfection to extremely low-salaried teachers who also paid the greatest part of the dues." Together, Haley, Goggin, and other teachers began tipping the balance of power in the NEA, but with help from Young. Before Young became superintendent, the city's schools had suffered through a period of administrative and political dysfunction during Benjamin Andrews' brief tenure in office, and then Edwin Cooley's. Cooley had antagonized teachers by implementing his notorious secret teacher evaluation system, among other things. He continually battled with teachers, particularly the Teachers Federation. His health eventually suffered, and he took extended leaves to recover. He finally resigned in early 1909. Meanwhile, the assistant and district superintendents who had worked together to lead the city's schools in Cooley's long absence performed so admirably that members of the board presented a resolution to eliminate the superintendency altogether. The resolution failed, but its authors had made their point. By mid-July of 1909, the board considered 50 men to become the next superintendent. The mayor strongly opposed women holding such a public office. Nonetheless, the board ultimately interviewed 6 finalists, including Young. The first 5 candidates spoke with the board for about 20 minutes each, but Young engaged with them for over 2 hours. Board members reportedly, quote, forgot she was a woman, as the irresistible impression of ability, of sympathy, of tact, of power, and broad-mindedness emanated from her. Then they thought only of getting her to rule the schools, and they voted unanimously for her, unquote. A woman board member said, quote, I consider Young the best educator in the United States so far as public school work is concerned. The selection of Ms. Young as superintendent of schools is the wisest thing that the board could possibly have done, unquote. She then noted that Young would address the board's pressing concerns about the relationship with the new superintendent, between the new superintendent and organized teachers. Quote, she will harmonize the whole teaching force. The teachers haven't felt in the past that they had the sympathy of the superintendent, and this is the one thing Chicago schools need more than anything else, unquote. And finally, Margaret Haley later recounted that board members had asked each candidate what they would do about the Federation. She explained that the other candidates dodged and sidetracked, but Young simply replied, I treat it as an educational organization. Haley concluded they gave her the job. On Young's first day, she vowed to keep her door open to the city's 6,000 teachers, a promise that she kept. She stressed her readiness to receive representatives of the Chicago Teachers Federation and, quote, I hope that all of us working together may bring harmony and the highest efficiency to the schools of Chicago, unquote. This was particularly important because Young sometimes had opposed the efforts of the Federation in its early years, and the Chicago Tribune even had reported that, quote, the choice of Mrs. Young was a blow to the Teachers Federation. At the time of its formation, it had the sympathy of Mrs. Young, but not after she perceived the uses to which it was being put, unquote. Young had to mend her relationship with the Federation. She soon saw a path to do this. After Young moved into her new office, city officials learned that President Taft would visit Chicago in a few weeks. They asked Young to stage an enormous rally of Chicago's students to welcome him. She and a team of organizers immediately got to work. When the day arrived, well over 150,000 students, teachers, and others from Chicago's public schools lined a 12-mile route, singing, dancing, performing instrumental music, and displaying their artistic handiwork as Taft's motorcade slowly drove through. Amazingly, the entire event went off without a hitch, much to the surprise of worried city residents. Reportedly, Taft said he had never witnessed any demonstration like it, both in scale and in meaningful intent. He reflected that these 150,000 Chicagoans are growing up to follow in the footsteps of their fathers and mothers and make this the greatest, well, certainly one of the greatest centers of influence for good and the elevation of the human race that the world knows. The great success of this enormous spectacle translated into strong political support for Young and the city's schools. Soon after Taft Day, Young pushed for and won pay increases for teachers, the first in over 2 decades. She eliminated Cooley's teacher evaluation system. She also won sick pay for teachers, long opposed by Cooley. With these changes, she convincingly gained teachers' support. Then, Young and teachers campaigned together for a broad array of other reforms. For 4 years, Young enjoyed unprecedented support not only from teachers, but also from the people of Chicago, as the city's schools became a source of immense pride rather than shame. At the end of Young's first year as superintendent, Chicago's teachers staged a massive celebration in her honor. They packed the great auditorium theater, filling its 5,000 seats, overflowing into the large lobby and spilling into the street. Teachers planned the event for nearly a year through representatives that they had elected from each school. The elaborate celebration featured songs written for Young, hundreds of children placing roses around her chair, processions of teachers and orchestra, dancers, and speakers, all while Young smiled and occasionally bowed. The Chicago Tribune reported, quote, "These old friends who have fought for and with Mrs. Young have clung to her, stood with her, believed in her, and made others do the same through the thick and the thin of school fights to which Chicago has been heir. They had something of a right to their pride," unquote. Young simply said, "This demonstration has been one of the most inspiring evenings of my life." This was not just a Chicago story, though. The Journal of Education reported, quote, "Never on either side of the sea was there anything to compare with this. And this was in Chicago, in the city that had been so long represented as one great chaotic mess of professional discord." Around this time, the Chicago Principals Club announced that it had launched a movement to elect Mrs. Young president of the National Education Association. Other educators around the country independently had the same idea. A Boston teacher and suffragist wrote to a woman Western State Superintendent to see what she thought of the idea of soliciting Young to run. Quote, "It has struck many of us that this would be a strategic time to try to elect a woman as president of the NEA. And owing to the widespread notice attracted by Mrs. Young's appointment, we have felt that it might be possible to swing the election for her." Furthermore, she continued, "The teaching force of the country is so largely made up of women that it's certainly only fair that we should have a woman president of this organization once. And my thought is that this is perhaps the most possible time while the interest in Mrs. Young is still fresh and keen." Through strategic organizing, hundreds of women teachers from around the country found ways to obtain NEA memberships for the first time and then traveled to the Boston General Assembly. Though another woman candidate for president had emerged through a misunderstanding, some deft behind-the-scenes work by Margaret Haley and Catherine Goggin resolved the tensions, with women teachers fully supporting Young. The old guard vigorously supported their own candidate, but in the end, Young decisively won with 617 votes to 376 for her opponent. The Boston Journal detailed the remarkable scene with, quote, "Hundreds of women madly embracing each other and screaming with joy. It was a distinct triumph for the women of the country, a triumph without parallel in the history of women's organizations, and they won out because they held the best hand," unquote. The Woman's Journal explained that Young's opposition was based solely on the ground that she was a woman, and that this campaign had made many converts to suffrage among the women. Back in Chicago, teachers went to unprecedented lengths to demonstrate their wholehearted support for Young. She needed that help, particularly as several politically charged matters emerged during her 4th year. First, newly appointed board members sought to strip Young of her responsibility to choose the city's textbooks. They wanted to choose the textbooks instead and receive kickbacks from publishers. Second, as African Americans moved to Chicago early in the Great Migration, Young vigorously opposed racially segregated schools despite strong agitation among white communities for them. She said, quote, "I cannot align myself in opposition to segregation of the sexes and favor separation for whites and blacks. We have mixed schools and we are proud of them," unquote. Third, she sought to implement the nation's first sex education program, but despite careful planning and strong early support, opponents launched powerful protests, eventually shutting the effort down. Most important, though, Illinois granted women suffrage on July 1st of 1913. Young said, "It is the greatest thing Illinois has ever done." That day, Young rode near the front of Chicago's large automobile parade in celebration. The famed British suffrage leader Emmeline Pankhurst said, quote, "I am convinced that the women of Illinois, among them are numbered such world-famous women as Jane Addams and Ella Flagg Young, will worthily use their newly won liberty." However, the celebratory spirit ended quickly for Young as several board members successfully removed some of her powers. Only a few weeks after the city's suffrage celebration, Young submitted her resignation because of this board interference. Immediately, women leaders around the city exploded with indignation at the conditions that had compelled Young to leave, and they demanded that the mayor eliminate the hostile influences on the board. John Dewey wrote his daughters about these events, confidently explaining that, quote, "This is where women's suffrage in Illinois comes in handy. The women will probably force the mayor and the board to keep her and not meddle anymore," unquote. Dewey was only partially correct, though. The mayor did contact Young in an attempt to address her concerns. He also insisted that the board restore her powers. She decided to return to the superintendency for a while. Shortly after Young's return, however, a board committee nonetheless removed some of Young's powers once again, and then a coup by these same heckling members resulted in Young's ouster on December 11th, 1913. The mayor expressed his regret at Young's removal, but most found his response to be very tepid. One board member pinned the blame squarely, quote, "The one man responsible is Mayor Carter H. Harrison and none else. Mrs. Young could not be used, and she retires with honor," unquote. So many Chicago women clamored to protest on Young's behalf that a strategy meeting had to move several times to successively larger venues. They ultimately planned a mass meeting to be held in the Auditorium Theater. Feeling pressured, the mayor removed 5 men from the board for actions hostile to Young, but they fought to stay on. Finding this insufficient, organizers of the mass meeting proceeded with their plans, completely filling and overflowing the Auditorium Theater. Several speakers, including Jane Addams, urged women to bring their new political power to bear on Young's behalf. Attendees approved a resolution demanding that the mayor restore Young to the superintendency. Across the country, though, others weighed in too. For example, thousands of teachers attending a Los Angeles institute passed a resolution supporting her continued service. Facing national as well as local pressure, Mayor Harrison finally reconfigured the board sufficiently that Young was reelected superintendent, and she resumed her duties. Young served as Chicago's superintendent for 2 more years, but these final years were marked by bitter battles with some board members. She found ingenious means of carrying on regardless. For instance, when, as she put it, quote, "College experts who are making a specialty of testing and standardizing public schools earnestly desire to march on the schools of Chicago, threatening an expensive external evaluation," unquote, Young instead proactively summoned the assistance of all school employees in conducting a thorough self-study on their own terms and published it as her 1914 annual report of the superintendent. Nonetheless, Young grew weary as ever-shifting forms of resistance dogged her efforts. She worked her last day in Chicago in December of 1915. Young died 3 years later during the Spanish flu pandemic. Chicago's flags flew at half-mast in her honor. Few were permitted to attend the graveside funeral, however, because of the city's restrictions on public assembly during the deadly outbreak. Thousands of students contributed pennies in her honor to help poor children attend school. Organized Chicago women planned a larger drive to build a city hall for women in Young's name, but the effort later faltered as the pandemic and a severely weakened post-war economy sapped resources. Young had asked her close friends to protect her privacy and Laura's, and they complied. She did not leave archives, which has made my work hard. Within a generation, Young's efforts largely were forgotten. Some of her ideas were attributed to others, including John Dewey. Young had thought that women and men eventually would share power on equal terms in schoolwork. This appeared to be the trend over the course of her life, and she herself certainly played many important roles in making it happen. Among schoolworkers and students, she staunchly cultivated individuality and freedom, her hobbies. She protested the encroaching movement towards standardization in schools. Instead, she inspired teachers to creatively modify the curriculum and bring their unique pedagogical approaches to their students. What new ideas have you today was her favorite greeting with teachers, administrators, and students alike. Their responses mattered and often led to changes in the schools. She resisted calls for centralized power, instead choosing to share power as much as possible while retaining her ultimate responsibility for the welfare of the whole. In her classrooms, students had voice in how activities unfolded. In her schools, she encouraged teachers to make important decisions together about governance, pedagogy, and curriculum, and she devoted attention to arts and humanities, creative expression. In her district, she established teachers' councils in which a large number of teachers systematically deliberated curriculum governance and policy with meaningful implementation of results. As superintendent, she established numerous channels through which she dialogued with members of the broad Chicago schools community, motivating them to contribute ideas and work together to realize them. Young encouraged individuality and freedom. At the same time, she nurtured a sense of community that made them possible. At each step of her career, she created ways for people to meet with each other to discuss work-related topics, and in settings that promoted their relaxed enjoyment. Food consistently played a key role in these events. So too did lively banter, give and take, and making plenty of room for free play of thought. Teachers looked forward to these meetings as they shared ideas and questioned orthodoxies, and they came to trust one another more deeply, ultimately helping each other in creating new ideas and practices. Young spent almost her entire career in the Chicago schools. She had taught many of its teachers and administrators, worked beside them, and fought with them to improve working conditions. She knew them, and they in turn knew her. They knew they could count on her to work on their behalf and to make good on her commitments. A remarkable number of teachers and administrators did their best to reciprocate. This broad and deep sense of community across the city provided the context in which a staggering number of important reforms flourished, especially during the first 4 years of Young's superintendency. In the end, Young faced significant backlash in her work. Much of it came from individuals and groups that feared women were becoming too powerful, significantly overstepping their traditional bounds. Young, as the woman holding the greatest position of public service in the country, no doubt served as a lightning rod for such attacks. She persisted as fully as she could while knowing that if she succumbed, it would be a setback for the larger movement. Right after Illinois granted women full suffrage, Emmeline Pankhurst had addressed a Chicago gathering of women activists, including Young. She said regarding both Illinois suffrage and Young's superintendency, quote, "Your victory has been our victory," unquote. More ominously, though, she declared, quote, "If one set of women fail, all women fail together," unquote. In the years since Young's superintendency, women still largely do not hold proportional share of school leadership positions across the country. So too do teachers continue to struggle against the constraints of tightly centralized power and pressure towards standardization, both which minimize the importance of teachers' individuality and freedom, not to mention their sense of community. Nonetheless, Young's legacy provides us with a remarkable example of how schools might work if freedom, individuality, and community truly were honored. There was a brief moment when Chicago's school workers felt empowered. Thank you.